Hey everyone, welcome back. I am so thrilled to have you here today. In this explainer, we're going to be looking at the business world in a completely different way. I want you to picture a ship out on the ocean. The captain? Well, they can control the sails, they can manage the crew, and they organize the cargo, but they have absolutely zero control over the weather. Business is exactly the same. Today, we're demystifying that unpredictable weather, what we call the external environment. And we're going to explore the actual strategic frameworks that world-class organizations use to navigate those storms and, catch the right winds.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here's a quick look at our agenda for today. We'll kick things off with the concept of the external environment, then we'll walk through the steps for environmental analysis. After that, we'll decode the pestle analysis, understand industry analysis, and finally, wrap the whole thing up with Porter's 5 forces model.
But before we get into all those analytical frameworks, I want you to consider a pretty high-stakes question. Why is it that some businesses literally thrive, while others, sometimes with the exact same resources, completely fail? It is a question that keeps executives up at night for sure. And the answer? It usually isn't just about what's happening inside the company's own walls. It's really about how they respond to the storm that's raging outside their control.
All right, that brings us to Section 1. The external environment. Let's define the ocean our business ship is currently sailing on.
So, what is it? The external environment encompasses all the conditions, institutions, and factors existing outside the organization. They are entirely beyond direct managerial control, but, and this is crucial, they absolutely dictate performance. Like we said, you can't control the weather, but you can definitely build a better storm shelter or, upgrade your boat. Think about companies like Apple and Samsung. As our source material points out, they are constantly having to adapt to new technological shifts and changing consumer preferences just to stay competitive. If they ever stop analyzing the outside world, they sink. It's that simple.
Now, to really make sense of this massive concept, it helps to break it down. We typically split the external environment into 2 categories, macro and micro. The macro, or general environment, is made up of those broad, universal sweeping forces that indirectly influence almost everyone. Think the overall economy, or massive new national laws. The micro, or industry environment, is much closer to home. These are the forces directly affecting your day-to-day operations. We're talking about your specific customers, your suppliers, your direct competitors. Basically, it's the difference between a massive global climate shift and a local thunderstorm right over your house.
So how do companies actually go about analyzing all these huge external forces? Let's move to Section 2, Steps for Environmental Analysis. We need a blueprint.
But before we look at the how, let's briefly touch on the why. Why even go through the trouble? Well, we analyze to identify opportunities, right? Like maybe spotting a growing middle class in an emerging market that's suddenly ready for your products. We also do it to recognize threats. Things like a looming economic downturn or some sudden regulatory change. This analysis is literally the foundation for strategic planning and figuring out where to allocate your resources. At the end of the day, it's about long-term sustainability. If you don't recognize evolving market forces, you just won't survive.
All right, let's look at the actual step-by-step process. Here are the 6 key steps organizations use. First up, scanning. This is gathering information from government reports, the news, and market research to just spot those early signals. Step 2, they identify and analyze which of those factors actually matter to them. Third, they monitor and forecast, trying to estimate likely future outcomes. Fourth, they assess the specific industry structure, which we'll actually dive into in a minute. Fifth, they take all that info and pinpoint the specific opportunities and threats. And finally, step 6, they formulate strategic responses. They adopt and innovate based on those insights. And remember, this isn't a one-and-done thing. It's a continuous, dynamic loop.
Okay, let's put a framework to that broad scanning phase we just talked about. Welcome to Section 3, Decoding Pestle Analysis. This is our wide-angle lens for the macro environment.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the pestle model takes an incredibly chaotic macro environment and just neatly organizes it into 6 manageable buckets. PESTLE is an acronym, and it stands for Political, Economic, Social, Technological, Legal, and Environmental Factors. By systematically looking at each of these dimensions, organizations can actually map out the long-term challenges and opportunities they're facing on a grand scale.
Let's run through exactly how this looks in the real world, using some examples straight from our source material. Political factors. Well, that's government actions. A new administration might completely alter tax or labor laws overnight. Economic conditions, like inflation, directly dictate consumer purchasing power. Under social factors, shifting demographics are driving massive demand for things like health and wellness products. Technological is a big one. Think about how the rise of AI is totally transforming banking right now. For legal, look at how strict data protection laws, like Europe's GDPR, completely changed how consumer data is handled globally. And finally, environmental pressures. These have literally forced the entire automotive industry to pivot to electric vehicles. Every single one of these letters represents a force that can make or break a business strategy.
All right, it's time to swap out that wide-angle lens for a telephoto lens. Section 4, Understanding Industry Analysis. We are zooming right in on the microenvironment now.
So while PESTLE looks at the whole wide world, industry analysis looks directly at your specific battleground. This is where we evaluate the structure, the market size, the growth potential, and the actual intensity of the competition within a specific sector. And this is not just some academic exercise, right? Investors use this to decide whether to even fund a startup, and policymakers use it to promote economic growth. It helps a company understand if they're walking into a stable market or an absolute war zone.
And speaking of war zones, how do we actually measure the intensity of that battle? That brings us to Section 5, Porter's 5 Forces Model.
And this brilliantly illustrates why Michael Porter's 1979 framework was such a game changer. Before this came along, companies mostly just looked at their direct, immediate competitors. Porter said, wait a minute, competitive intensity is actually shaped by 5 distinct critical forces, not just one. It gives you this incredibly holistic view of everything shaping an industry's profitability.
Let's break these 5 forces down real quick. First, you've got the threat of new entrants. Basically, how easy is it for a new player to jump in and compete with you? High entry barriers protect industries like steel manufacturing, but online retail? Constant new competition. Second is the bargaining power of suppliers. If there are only a few suppliers, like in the diamond industry, they hold immense power over you. Third is the bargaining power of buyers. Think of giant retailers like Walmart. They buy in such massive volumes, they can literally dictate lower prices to manufacturers. Fourth is the threat of substitutes. This happens when customers can just switch to alternative solutions if your prices get too high, like shifting from traditional fossil fuels to solar power. And finally, industry rivalry. This is the intensity of the fight among existing competitors. Just look at the intense price wars and crazy fast innovation in the smartphone market.
I really want to highlight this quote directly from our source material. This framework allows businesses to evaluate the overall attractiveness of an industry and determine the strategic position they should adopt. Because honestly, that is the ultimate goal of all of this. Whether you're using the macro PESTLE analysis or the micro Porter's 5 forces, you are ultimately trying to figure out 2 main things. First, is this industry even attractive enough that I want to be in it? And second, if I'm in it, where exactly do I position myself to protect my business from threats while grabbing the best opportunities?
So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a challenge, a question to chew on today based on PESTLE and Porter's. What recent external shift, maybe it's a wild new AI technology, some new environmental regulation, or a totally new buyer preference, threatens to disrupt the balance of your specific industry today? Remember, the weather's always changing outside. The most successful organizations out there aren't the ones who just ignore the storm. They're the ones who learn how to read the clouds. So take these frameworks, scan your own environment, and see what you find. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep learning.